Adventure is Nigh has a really big disc.
Big disc energy.
Well, an average-sized disc. I'm, of course, talking about the Adventure is Nigh Blu-ray discs. Season 1 and Season 2 of Adventure is Nigh are now available to own. That means you can watch the river crossing shenanigans of your favorite adventurers, even if there's no more internet. These blue discs include every episode of Season 1 and 2 beautifully remastered, Q&As, behind-the-scenes content, and a commentary track on every single episode. Honestly, we probably shouldn't have done that. We get sidetracked easily. I don't know if you've seen The Substance.
I was going to say, I was waiting for a break so I could be like, let's talk about how they use nudity in The Substance.
Head on over to our DFTBA store to order your copy or go to adventureisnigh.horse. It's a real website.
Last weekend saw the release of Brand New Day, the latest entry in the Sony Pictures Spider-Man franchise. I've been told by HR that I'm not allowed to call it the Spamunk anymore. It garnered strong reviews and made seemingly all of the money, ending Benny Safdie's brief but memorable reign as the king of the 2026 box office.
I'm Bowser Jr.
What you are, buddy, is box office gold. This is technically Sony's third, or perhaps even fourth, attempt at a live-action theatrical Spider-Man franchise in the 21st century, following on from the Sam Raimi trilogy, the Mark Webb duology, and now with Destin Daniel Cretton picking up after John Watts' trilogy. And these movies are fascinating. Released alongside Stephen Norrington's Blade and Bryan Singer's X-Men, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man was one of the movies that helped to kickstart the modern superhero boom. Raimi's first two movies remain the gold standard for superhero cinema. Raimi's Spider-Man 2 remains in the pantheon of the greatest live-action superhero movies more than 2 decades after it was released. There's always been an interesting tension within these movies. Because of licensing agreements dating back to the 1990s, Sony owns the film rights to Spider-Man, while Marvel's corporate owner Disney retained the rights to virtually every other Marvel character.
Is that everyone?
But you wanted more?
Fun fact here. When Sony licensed Spider-Man for film, they also had the option to license every other Marvel character in the catalog, but they chose not to because they thought that Spider-Man was far more valuable than the entire back library combined, which I'm sure that their modern shareholders agree with entirely.
No.
This meant, for the first decade and a half of Spider-Man movies, the web-slinging wonder remained separate from the shared continuity that Marvel Studios started building with Iron Man, known as the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But after the less-than-amazing box office and critical reception of Mark Webb's amazing Spider-Man films, a guy named Webb goes on to make 2 disappointing Spider-Man movies.
What are the odds?
Sony and Disney reached a compromise. Disney would be able to use Spider-Man in their crossover films like Captain America Civil War and Avengers Infinity War, and in return, Sony would be able to use Marvel characters like Tony Stark and Steve Rogers.
Pretty sure this guy's a war criminal now, but whatever. I have to show these videos. It's required by the state. Let's do it.
In their Spider-Man movies, starting with Homecoming, released in 2017. However, what is really interesting over the almost decade since the release of Homecoming is the sense in which the power dynamics of that relationship have shifted as the rules of superhero cinema have altered. Watching the Tom Holland Spider-Man movies can feel like watching 2 studios renegotiate the terms of their partnership in real time. It can feel like Spidey's real superpower is passive aggression towards his corporate owners. So we're going to talk about that this week. We're going to talk about how these movies exist largely as a tug of war over intellectual property, how the dynamics have shifted over the past decade, and what that says about the state of the genre at this moment in time. And, to be frank, this will involve talking about the film with spoilers. But I'm not going to be sadistic about this. I don't want to ruffle any feathers. I don't want any drama. Oops, sorry, that's a different Zendaya movie.
Sorry about that.
I guess you could say this has been a pun-ishing run. Now, this is not a review show. We're more interested in talking about context and trends. But it is worth acknowledging up front that there are parts of Brand New Day that work reasonably well. After all, I don't want to be Mr. Negative here. We'll leave that to the special guest villain who appears in the movie. Fresh from the Christopher Nolan bootcamp of making the Odyssey, Tom Holland turns in his best performance yet as Spider-Man. While it seems unlikely that the Marvel Cinematic Universe will ever manage a decent adaptation of The Punisher, Jon Bernthal is having fun doing the Jon Bernthal thing.
Which you went to.
And Bernthal and Holland remain a charming screen duo. More than that, the film benefits from the involvement of director Destin Daniel Cretton. With all due respect to John Watts, who directed the previous 3 Spider-Man films, Cretton is a much more experienced filmmaker with a much stronger filmography, give or take the last act of Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. Brand New Day just looks better than the previous 6 films featuring Tom Holland as Spider-Man, with strong lighting and compositional choices and good use of shadow and shading. It's a significant improvement from the last couple of films, where it honestly felt like several of the actors sharing the same frame had never been in the same room together. The film also does a good job visualizing Spider-Man's swing through New York, clearly taking its cues from the recent Insomniac games. The swing doesn't look quite as good as it did in the Raimi films, but it's nice to have Spidey navigating the glass canyons of Manhattan, after a trilogy of films that seemed intent on pushing away from that by putting Spidey in the suburbs, or Washington, or Europe, or Ellis Island, or a big, shapeless CGI void, or other locations where the web-slinging wonder had nothing to swing off. It was cute when Homecoming did things like put Spider-Man on a ferry or a plane, where his natural abilities were kinda useless, but it's also nice that Brand New Day serves us a hamburger that comes in a bun. So to get this out of the way up front, I didn't hate Brand New Day. It's certainly not the worst film I've seen this year. It doesn't even have Chris Pratt tied to a chair.
Oh, Jesus, oh, God!
And it's also not the worst Spider-Man movie that Tom Holland has made. It is, unfortunately, the worst movie starring Tom Holland, Zendaya, and Jon Bernthal to release in the last fortnight, but the other one happened to be the best film of the year, so what are you gonna do? With all that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about Spider-Man. One of the things that I unironically love about the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies is the extent to which they care about people. These films not only give Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson rich inner lives, allowing them to be complicated and flawed individuals,
And I know I'm not your father.
Then stop pretending to be.
with their own hopes and dreams. In particular, they allow Peter to be unlikable in a way that isn't cool or badass.
Go get him, Tiger.
Kirsten Dunst's MJ is a mess, a young woman with complicated attachment issues and insecurities rooted in a dysfunctional relationship to her father, which explains why she's drawn to emotionally distant and unavailable men, dating a billionaire heir with daddy issues,
So just keep your mouth shut about stuff you don't understand.
almost marrying a man whose job literally takes him off the planet, and ending up in a long-term relationship with a man who can't be counted on to be present because he lives half his life inside a mask.
But my best friend, who cares so much about me, he's nothing to me but an empty seat.
I understand that psychology. Dunst's MJ feels like a person. In contrast, despite the fact that Zendaya is one of the best young actors of her generation, who has starred in 2 of the best movies of the year so far, and who still has Dune Part 3 coming down the pipe, I can't tell you anything about her version of MJ. Yes, she's into conspiracy theories and is vaguely counter-establishment.
So Paris tomorrow. Go to the Eiffel Tower.
I read it was secretly built as a mind control antenna to create an army of the insane.
But what does she want? What does she need? What is it that draws her to Peter Parker? Peter seemingly didn't even know her actual name until the end of Homecoming,
My friends call me MJ.
but is madly in love with her by the start of Far From Home.
I'm gonna tell her how I feel.
And to be clear, none of this is to disparage or dismiss Zendaya's performance. She gives what might be the best technical performance in Brand New Day, balancing vulnerability and steeliness, and doing a really good body swap scene. But the character is remarkably underserved and underdeveloped. For not the first time this July, Zendaya does Trojan work. Raimi's Spider-Man wears its influences on its sleeve, underscoring this emphasis on dysfunction by ending the second film with an obvious shout-out to The Graduate, one of the classics of the new Hollywood movement. It's an ending that signals that these are 2 complicated people doing something that is not as neat and tidy as it might initially appear. In contrast, John Watts' influences seem to begin and end at John Hughes movies, which I love, but without any of the interiority that made those characters so compelling. And it isn't just Peter and MJ. The Raimi films built out a large supporting cast of distinctive characters who feel like they have something approaching an inner life. Now, Patrick Williams did a really great video on this, which you absolutely should watch if you haven't already. But it is very telling that we've gone from Peter having a very distinctive and mimetic landlord,
Hi. What's hi? Can I spend it?
who, despite being presented as broadly comedic, is allowed a moment of genuine empathy and compassion and concern for Peter in the 3rd film.
He is a good boy. He must be in some kind of trouble.
to an anonymous dubbed voiceover performance at the end of No Way Home.
Rent is due on the 1st of the month. Don't be late.
The human beings in the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies have lives and agency and struggle. Uncle Ben and Aunt May are working-class individuals struggling to make ends meet in turn of the millennium New York.
When the plant's senior electrician is laid off after 35 years, what else would you call it? I am on my ass.
When Aunt May gives Peter her final $20, you can feel how much that means to the characters.
No, I can't take that.
Yes, you can. You can take this money from me. For God's sake, it's not much. Now take it.
More than that, though, these films place a strong emphasis on the idea of the community, and of people, of the lives that Peter saves by being Spider-Man. Peter's heroism is constantly built around saving civilians. And the films are obsessed with his relationship to New York as a physical space, populated by human beings. The recent live-action Spider-Man movies have none of that. Peter goes to an expensive prep school, which can afford to organize trips to Washington, staying in fancy hotels, and even around Europe. The Watts films were largely shot in Atlanta, Georgia, lending the world an uncanny feeling. And not the uncanny feeling that you get from Brand New Day's special guest villain. Peter is bankrolled by a billionaire, so he never has to worry about money. He flies around the world in private jets. And he even gets his own army of drones. The closest that these films come to acknowledging working-class struggle is with the villainous Adrian Toomes, the Vulture, who adopts the language of a struggling working-class hero.
We have to pick up after them. We have to eat their table scraps. We build their roads and we fight all their wars and everything. They don't care about us. I know you know what I'm talking about, Peter.
But who, with his opulent lifestyle, is obviously just self-mythologizing here.
Why are you telling me this?
I need a little time to get her airborne.
Even in Brand New Day, which is set in a universe where the Avengers have all forgotten Peter Parker, there's no sense that Peter exists in anything close to the real world. In this newly remade world, Peter doesn't seem to have a job. The film makes a big deal of how Peter doesn't really have a life outside of being Spider-Man. But not only can he afford to rent a loft in New York City, but he also has top-of-the-line tech and a large language model assistant voiced by Naomi Watts, making it one of 3 IP blockbusters this year to ask the vital question, the Raimi Peter had to scrounge and save to buy flowers for Mary Jane, but this version seems to have an unlimited flower budget. And look, people are undoubtedly going to jump into the comments to point out that there have been periods in the comic book character's history when he has been wealthy. J. Michael Straczynski's run overlapping with Civil War, the Spider-Man Worldwide era under Dan Slott. But those were the exceptions that proved the rule. In fact, those were subsections of those authors' particular runs. Holland has been the longest-serving and most prolific live-action theatrical Spider-Man, and it really does feel like a missed opportunity in this modern world of oligarchs and income inequality, of billionaire supervillains, that the genre's most famous working-class superhero is no longer allowed to be working class. But it's more than just that. There is, in Brand New Day, no sense of a world that exists 5 feet or even 5 seconds beyond the frame that is currently on screen. For all that it aspires to create the sense of a bustling comic book shared universe, it's impossible to imagine what these characters are doing when they are not literally on screen in front of the audience. The film finds Michael Mando, who gave one of the great television performances of the decade in Better Call Saul, reprising his role as Mac Gargan from Homecoming. He has now adopted his comic book persona of the Scorpion. But why?
What?
Scorpions. Gargan.
Outside the fact that it's a thing that fans will recognize from the comic, what does Mac Gargan actually want? And why does he think that dressing up as a Scorpion will help him accomplish it? The film focuses on the relationship between Peter Parker and Frank Castle, which is largely just an excuse for Tom Holland and John Bernthal to hang out, which is fine. The pair work very well together, having previously starred in Pilgrimage and in The Odyssey. But how does Peter, a kid who has internalized the idea of loss to become a superhero who saves lives, feel about Frank Castle using a similar tragedy to justify becoming a mass murderer? It really doesn't seem like he's that bothered about it at all.
Go home, Frank!
At one point during the film, Spider-Man appeals to the Hulk to remember him, and the Hulk pauses as if he might actually do so. Tom Holland has hinted in the press that one member of the Avengers remembers him.
I think no one remembers that I'm Spider-Man, apart from one
Nobody remembers
person.
that you're Peter Parker.
They
They
know
know Spider-Man.
Spider-Man is Peter Parker.
Yeah, they know
apart from
Spider-Man. They just don't know.
one person.
Okay.
This is a smart idea in theory. The Hulk is a separate person from Bruce Banner, so maybe the spell didn't affect him. It's also something that has come up in the comics. Except, of course, This just raises the question of when have Spider-Man and the Hulk meaningfully interacted before? What is their pre-existing relationship? Why are we even using the Hulk here as a lecturer on genetics who also happens to have a green monstrous alter ego that he can't control, instead of, say, the Lizard? The film is singularly uninterested in answering any of these questions that might inform plot, theme, or character, or any of the other basic ingredients of storytelling. The answer to any of these questions is just the liberal application of intellectual property. Gargan is dressed as a scorpion because he does that in the comics, and who cares about character motivation? Spidey and the Punisher are buddies because people like the Punisher, so why not? The primary antagonist of the film is Jean Grey, a member of the X-Men. So I guess the third theatrical adaptation of the Dark Phoenix saga in 25 years is incoming.
Rest assured, this will be the
third
time we have destroyed it, and we have become exceedingly efficient at it.
Jean is a psychic, and she spends most of the movie jumping into people's minds and controlling their bodies, which is a gross violation of their autonomy. She drives tanks, and she makes people shoot each other, and she turns New York City into a war zone, endangering hundreds, possibly thousands of lives. But in the end, the film decides that this is okay because Jean is looking for her sister. After all, Jean is recognizably part of the larger comic book IP. She's not one of those anonymous NPCs that populate the city. The audience cares about her and her wants because they recognize her name from pre-existing films, television shows, and comics, and therefore, she has value in the way that an ordinary person in this universe does not. This is the logic of so much of the MCU, and where the classic Spider-Man tagline of,
"And with great power, there must also come great responsibility,"
comes the addendum, and don't let anybody try to temper that power. Throughout these films, there's a recurring sense that surrendering his power is the worst thing that Peter can do. When Tony puts safety protocols in his suit in Homecoming, Peter just jailbreaks it.
Activating instant kill.
When Quentin Beck suggests that maybe a teenager shouldn't have access to an army of killer drones that might allow him to accidentally put out a hit in a romantic rival, it's just a ruse to take advantage of the poor boy. And look, we've talked before about how the modern superhero movie in general, and the Marvel Cinematic Universe in particular, have been defined by the war on terror, down to the weird tendency to dress superheroes in tactical body armor that is occasionally painted in the color of their comic book costumes. But there is something strange in how hard the Tom Holland Spider-Man movies lean into that, even as a recurring joke.
Activate instant kill!
Spider-Man is a teenager operating the kind of surveillance that would make the Patriot Act blush, and commanding an army of drones. Even in Brand New Day, which ostensibly eschews the character's relationship to Tony Stark to get back to basics, and in which director Destin Daniel Cretton directly invokes the Dark Knight, Peter is operating citywide surveillance. And while the Dark Knight at least understood, well,
this is wrong.
Brand New Day doesn't seem to have any greater opinion on beyond the fact that it's pretty cool. Even in Brand New Day, Peter's attempts to regulate his powers are treated as inherently monstrous, and, as in Far From Home, they just serve to give the villains what they want. We're a long way from the Sam Raimi films, where, just as in the original Lee and Ditko comics and many of the runs that followed, particularly like Brian Michael Bendis and Mark Bagley's Ultimate Spider-Man, what separated Peter from his villains was that he understood that his abilities didn't make him better, or more worthy, or more deserving than anybody else. In the Raimi films, Norman Osborn and Otto Octavius are villains because they believe their power gives them the right to do whatever they want.
There are 8 million people in this city, and those teeming masses exist for the sole purpose of lifting the few exceptional people onto their shoulders. You, me, we're exceptional.
And that anyone who might try to stop them must be evil.
I miscalculated. I couldn't have miscalculated.
Here, it's fine for these characters to do whatever they want or feel is justified, as long as the character we recognize from the intellectual property is doing it for a reason that matters to her. And look, maybe it makes sense that Peter Parker might be able to forgive Jean Grey for walking a stranger into oncoming traffic, but it feels a bit less plausible that Frank Castle, whose whole shtick is that he punishes people, seems perfectly fine with it by the end of the movie. This is a serious problem with the recent Spider-Man movies. They've just become intellectual property vending machines.
Hi, I'm Captain America.
Where characters and actors return to repeat mimetic catchphrases and strike familiar poses.
Hello, Peter. The power of the sun in the palm of my hand. Power of the sun.
In the palm of your hand.
complete with awkward applause breaks that are really jarring when you watch the movies at home.
I'm something of a scientist myself.
Please clap.
This is also the case with Jean Grey, the movie's functional antagonist. Her role in Brand New Day is very similar to that of Spider-Man villain Mr. Negative. Mr. Negative, of course, was a character introduced during the comics event Brand New Day, and has rapidly rocketed up the ranks of Spider-Man's rogues, in large part due to his inclusion in the Insomniac video games that have been a huge touchstone for the movies. However, Mr. Negative doesn't have the same name recognition cultural cachet as Jean Grey, so, like using the Hulk instead of the Lizard, we use Jean Grey instead of Mr. Negative. Because if you're a major studio, you want to use that IP freely. This is a shame, because there is a sense that these movies do, at least partially, want to be about things. No Way Home, for example, is very obviously trying to be a metaphor for immigration at a time when that is a hugely charged topic in contemporary American life. It is a film about the horror of sending displaced refugees back to certain death.
We can't send them back. Not yet. Oh, some of these guys are gonna die.
I know, I get it, but we can't just send them home to die.
It's a theme that resonates, even in the choice of location of the final battle.
A place that represents second chances.
And even this movie, Brand New Day, wants to be a film about the male loneliness epidemic, about the idea that Peter cutting himself off from social contact might be literally turning him into a monster, spending too much time on the web and leaving sticky white fluid everywhere. These are good ideas, and they're solid thematic groundings for superhero movies. But the films themselves are much less interested in being about anything than they are in litigating their relationship to the intellectual property. Brand New Day, for example, spends more time litigating the constraints of Jean Grey's powers. She can only jump 30 feet at a time and can string together a sequence of jumps to travel further, than it cares about the psychology of any of these characters. You can see that just by looking at the villains of the films. 4 films into his own franchise, Tom Holland's Spider-Man has faced a villain obsessed with Tony Stark.
Yeah, but I understand that selling weapons to criminals is wrong.
How do you think your buddy Stark paid for that tower? Or any of his little toys?
Another villain obsessed with Tony Stark.
To the man who brought us all together, our former boss, Tony Stark.
A sinister
1, 2, 3, 4, 5
of villains inherited from previous Spider-Man franchises. And one of the 5 original X-Men. The closest it feels like Tom Holland's Spider-Man's come to facing a villain that feels like his own is maybe Scorpion, but I guess we'll never actually know.
You sure you want to do this, Scorpion?
You think I'm Scorpion?
So you know what? Let's meet the movie where it's at. Let's take the film at face value. Let's engage with what it actually is and what it is trying to accomplish as a piece of mass-market franchise media produced by Sony Pictures in collaboration with Marvel Studios, putting the brand in Brand New Day. This iteration of Spider-Man movies began with Homecoming, a film enthusiastic and eager to be part of the shared continuity of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, building off Tom Holland's debut in Civil War and worshipping at the altar of Robert Downey Jr. and Chris Evans. It's insane how much that movie wants the audience to know that it is in continuity with the MCU, with a meaty supporting role for Jon Favreau as Happy Hogan, and even bringing back Gwyneth Paltrow, who had been pointedly absent from the Marvel fold for a number of years.
So, no Pepper? She's not coming? No.
To the point that Civil War had to openly acknowledge it.
Is Pepper here? I didn't see her.
We're taking a break. It's nobody's fault.
However, with the release of Endgame, it seemed like the power balance between Marvel and Sony shifted somewhat. With Tony Stark dead and Steve Rogers retired, and with Disney's recent purchase of Fox still a few years away from allowing full integration of the X-Men, Sony seemed to realize that they were holding a winning hand and that Marvel needed Spider-Man a lot more than Sony needed the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Far From Home, the Spider-Man movie released directly after Avengers Endgame, opens by transitioning from the Columbia logo to the Virgin Mary, while the Marvel logo
bittersweet memories
is set somewhat ironically to Whitney Houston's I Will Always Love You, a song that is frequently interpreted as a breakup song, but which is actually a cover version of a classic Dolly Parton song that was written as a professional farewell to her mentor and business partner, Porter Wagoner. Narratively, this is justified as a fond farewell to the character of Tony Stark, but it does also feel like something of a statement of intent from Sony. Far From Home opens with Peter Parker ducking Nick Fury's calls.
Heads up, Nick Fury's calling you. You sent Nick Fury to voicemail?
Yeah. He's trying desperately not to be in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. For his part, Fury, who is as much an architect of the shared Marvel Cinematic Universe as Tony Stark was,
Mr. Stark, you've become part of a bigger universe.
laments his own sense of impotence, and laments his inability to control Spider-Man.
I used to know everything. Then I come back 5 years later, and now I know nothing. And a high school kid is dodging my calls.
In the end, it's revealed that the Nick Fury scene in the film is not even Nick Fury at all. Meanwhile, Quentin Beck seems to be constructing a parody of a Marvel film.
Right, fly, blah, blah, blah. I'm not in love with this choreography, but it'll do.
Right down to the nonsense exposition to drive a third-act finale.
They're somehow merged into something...
Into something else. It's drawing energy from the Earth's core.
See, now that's some bullshit.
It feels quite pointed that right after Marvel Studios released Endgame, the next entry in the cinematic universe is about a bunch of villainous VFX workers who dare to form some kind of union? It was around this time, by the way, that there were reports of friction between Sony and Marvel over the character of Spider-Man and the nature of their relationship. And it does feel like a little bit of that animosity has dripped into the text of the franchise as a whole. This passive aggression becomes more pronounced in No Way Home, where Peter shoves the big shared universe guest star Dr. Stephen Strange into a pocket universe.
I've been dangling over the Grand Canyon for 12 hours.
I know.
So that he can spend more time with an ensemble gathered from earlier Sony Spider-Man franchises. This feels like a conscious realignment of the brand.
I love you guys.
Sony realizing that they hold pocket aces, that what they have already is as valuable as what Marvel could potentially offer them. It feels worth acknowledging here that the climax of No Way Home finds the Sony Pictures characters knocking Captain America's shield off of the Statue of Liberty. There's a certain sense of cockiness here, but it tracks. Spider-Man is, after all, to quote Far From Home's Ben Mendelsohn, an absolute motherfucking porn star. And don't worry, I'm allowed to say that because I'm quoting him directly. It's like C-SPAN rules. It's also my favorite comic being published at DC right now. Since Endgame, 3 of the 4 highest-grossing Marvel films have been No Way Home, Far From Home, and Brand New Day. Incidentally, the other film in that quartet, and the only non-Spider-Man MCU movie to break $1 billion since Endgame, was Deadpool and Wolverine, which also relied on intellectual property which did not originate in Marvel Studios itself. So it feels somewhat pointed. While Brand New Day is saturated with crossovers and references, very few of them, outside of 2 brief appearances from Florence Pugh, can trace their roots back to the established Marvel Studios properties under Kevin Feige. John Bernthal originated his take on Frank Castle on Netflix. The Villainous Hand debuted on Netflix. The Netflix Marvel shows were overseen by Marvel Television instead of Marvel Studios, thus by Jeff Loeb instead of Kevin Feige. This is why they exist in a strange liminal state of continuity, only able to obliquely reference the events of the film.
I mean, if he had an iron suit or a magic hammer, maybe?
There's you, me, the big green dude and his crew.
I saw the incident up close. Now, unless this sidearm that I'm wearing suddenly turns into some kind of magic hammer, this whole job is irrelevant.
There was a great deal of debate at the time about whether the shows were even in continuity. It also feels somewhat pointed that the films made the choice to recast a number of major actors from the television shows to play different roles in the films themselves.
Sure you're ready for that, Mr. Whitman?
By the way, that sound clip is the only evidence that exists that 2-time Academy Award winner Mahershala Ali played Blade in the MCU. But don't worry, I'm absolutely certain that we'll get to see Kit Harington again. The solo film rights to the Hulk famously reside with Universal rather than with Marvel Studios, to the point that the closest that audiences are going to get to an adaptation of Planet Hulk is in a Thor film.
So take that, Universal. Now what are you gonna do? You could have had a piece of this, but no, we haven't done it.
Even the villainous organization known as Damage Control had an aborted sitcom on ABC. All of these existed outside the purview of Marvel Studios president and baseball cap enthusiast Kevin Feige. And that's without getting into the Jean Grey of it all, who is obviously tied to the X-Men franchise, which for years were controlled by Fox rather than by Disney. There's a sense, watching No Way Home and Brand New Day, that Sony is no longer relying on the generosity of Disney, and that they know it. After all, the trend is not unique to Spider-Man. Between Multiverse of Madness, The Marvels, and Deadpool and Wolverine, the past 2 years of Marvel have been saturated with references to the Fox X-Men. The studio's most successful project in recent years has arguably been X-Men 97, an animated continuation of a Fox television show. And they even used the classic cartoon X-Men theme in Ms. Marvel. The company has spent a lot of time trying to coast off nostalgia for those Netflix shows like Daredevil, Jessica Jones, Luke Cage, and The Punisher, to the point that somehow an Iron Fist revival doesn't seem impossible. Hell, the trailers for the upcoming Doomsday, the company's next gigantic crossover, lean incredibly hard on nostalgia for the Fox X-Men. For years, the standard line with these properties, like the Sony Spider-Man franchises, the Fox X-Men, and even the Marvel streaming shows, was that they were being mismanaged by the studios that were running them, and that Disney needed to take ownership of them so that they could do them properly, reboot them, make them more comics accurate, and fold them into the MCU from scratch. But since Marvel Studios has folded these characters under their umbrella, the studio's only consistent source of success has been nostalgia for the work of other studios, while its own in-house franchises have struggled. It's almost as if having a diverse pool of studios making different kinds of blockbusters, rather than a single assembly line process designed to produce a uniform style from a single company, is a healthy commercial environment and helps to keep the genre relatively fresh. In an era where even Marvel's advertising acknowledges the existence of superhero fatigue, and where none of the studio's 3 films last year could crack the end-of-year box office top 10, the rules have changed. And Brand New Day often feels like it's a movie that is explicitly about that. It's honestly a little depressing that this is a large part of what there is to talk about with Brand New Day, a film from an incredibly talented filmmaker and which is going to be one of the biggest hits of the year. It's frustrating how much of modern pop culture has become the cinematic equivalent of watching executives move line items around spreadsheets. It would be cool to be able to talk about Brand New Day the way we did about The Odyssey, or even those Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies, as a film that feels like it has something to say about the world or the human experience, rather than just the brand. To prepare for the release of Brand New Day, I rewatched a bunch of Spider-Man movies. The first 2 Raimi Spider-Man movies are fantastic. They are classics. The third one is interesting. It's interesting because, kinda like X-Men 3 The Last Stand, it feels like it arrived ahead of the curve.
I'm the Juggernaut, bitch!
These are both films overstuffed with ideas, memes, and intellectual property. Spider-Man 3 has a new Green Goblin, Venom, Sandman, Gwen Stacy. It overloads the film with stuff from Spider-Man lore, rather than giving any of it room to breathe. Still, revisiting the messiness of Spider-Man 3 in the context of the modern superhero boom, I was charmed by how much it still feels like a personal film from Raimi. At its core, this is a story about a nerdy little dweeb letting fame go to his head.
I don't know, I guess I've become something of an icon. They love me.
And letting it destroy his personal relationships.
That was our kiss. Why would you do that?
Even in its cartoonishness and its absurdity, it feels like a strangely personal story from Raimi, who was reportedly so difficult to work with on Spider-Man 2 that he destroyed his relationship with long-term composer Danny Elfman, who did not return to score the third film because, quote, the person who was there at the end of Spider-Man 2 was not Sam. I don't know who it was, but it wasn't Sam. It was as close to living out Invasion of the Body Snatchers as I've ever experienced. It feels somewhat pointed that Raimi, who would eventually repair his relationship with Elfman, would follow up Spider-Man 2 with a movie about a guy whose worst tendencies are accelerated by a pod from outer space. None of this serves to make Spider-Man 3 a masterpiece.
So good.
But it does help the movie to feel personal in a way that the live-action Spider-Man movies that followed simply have not. This isn't to say that the modern superhero genre can't produce these sorts of organic and personal stories. Gunn's Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is a deeply personal work about what it feels to be discarded as a creative, and in that case, by a literally faceless corporation. Even last year, Thunderbolts was fantastic. And even in terms of movies that do serve as brand management for the Spider-Man franchise, the 2 Spider-Verse movies are really incredible. In the abstract, they're guilty of many of the same problems as something like No Way Home or Brand New Day, full of memes, cameos, and references.
You don't even get me started on Doctor Strange and the little nerd back on Earth 1999-99.
Often the same memes, cameos, and references.
Hello, Peter.
But they still work better. Part of this is that they find a way to weave their themes into the intellectual property maintenance. The Spider-Verse films are about Miles Morales figuring out where he belongs in the intellectual property.
Can I return it if it doesn't fit?
It could have been anyone behind the mask.
But they expand that theme to explore the idea of what it means to be a young person of color, or even just a young person, trying to make their way in the larger world.
For years I've been taking care of this little boy, right? Wherever you go from here, you have to promise to take care of that little boy for me. Make sure he never forgets where he came from. And he never lets anyone at those big fancy places he's gonna be in Tell him that he doesn't belong there.
You don't belong here. You never did.
The discussions of canon events and continuity are just a metaphor for the way that adults explain the vast inhuman systems of the world to their children.
Bad things are gonna happen. It makes us who we are.
The idea that the world that children know is built upon the suffering of others, and that part of becoming an adult is reckoning with that and having the courage to fight it in what small ways an individual can.
Everyone keeps telling me how my story is supposed to go. Nah, I'ma do my own thing.
The films excellently integrate continuity, theme, and visual storytelling. For example, in the scene where Peter B. Parker explains that this is just how the system works to Miles, the pair are literally navigating the cogs of a vast inhuman machine. More broadly, the conversations in which Miles and Gwen try to explain their spider lives to their parents.
I can do all these things, but I can't help the people I love the most, and they can only know half of who I am.
Resonate profoundly with the fear and anxiety felt by every teenager who has ever tried to share who they truly are with a loved one.
You gotta promise nothing's gonna change.
Papa, I will always love you.
You gotta promise.
Always.
And the truth is that the Spider-Verse films are still Spider-Man movies. They reject the sort of militarism that has come to define so much of the modern superhero genre. This isn't a story about a kid getting a suit with an instant kill mode or a fleet of killer drones. When a superhero is introduced, operating a paramilitary strike force to police the walls of reality itself,
And all this time, I have been the only one holding it all together.
recruiting vulnerable teens in desperate need of the approval of a distant father figure, the Spider-Verse films realize that he is very obviously the villain. The Spider-Verse movies remember that Spider-Man is not a power fantasy. He is instead an empowerment fantasy. And they do all the IP crossover stuff that defines so much modern franchise cinema as well, but in a way that is integrated into the themes of the stories that they are telling,
Anyone can wear the mask.
rather than distorting them or distracting from them. And this is honestly part of what the frustration is with so many of these IP movies, from The Flash to Deadpool and Wolverine to Brand New Day to No Way Home. It's the understanding that they don't have to be like that. Movies can have existing intellectual property, but they can also function as cohesive narratives. They can tell stories and have things to say. But these sorts of projects feel fewer and further between as they become increasingly about the process of managing these vast machines of intellectual property. As the genre contracts in the coming years, the box office power concentrating around fewer and fewer core properties, it's only going to trend further in this direction. On some level, it's fascinating to see these major studios measuring the size of their web shooters through the prism of summer blockbusters, even if it's not necessarily the most dramatically compelling thing to watch. Brand New Day knows that Spider-Man is, to quote Ben Mendelsohn, an absolute motherfucking porn star, but that doesn't give the film the right to just spelunk all over everybody. I've been Darren Mooney, and this was The Backdrop.